The Life and Passion of Cyprian, Bishop and Martyr, by Pontius the Deacon. Although Cyprian, the devout priest and glorious witness of God, composed many writings whereby the memory of his worthy name survives, and although the profuse fertility of his eloquence and of God's grace so expands itself in the exuberance and richness of his discourse that he will probably never cease to speak even to the end of the world, yet, since to his works and deserts it is justly due that his example should be recorded in writing, I have thought it well to prepare this brief and compendious narrative. Not that the life of so great a man can be unknown to any, even of the heathen nations, but that to our posterity also this incomparable and lofty pattern may be prolonged into immortal remembrance. It would assuredly be hard that, when our fathers have given such honor even to lay people and catechumens who have obtained martyrdom for reverence of their very martyrdom, as to record many, or I had nearly said, well nigh all, of the circumstances of their sufferings, so that they might be brought to our knowledge, also, who as yet were not born, the passion of such a priest and such a martyr as Cyprian should be passed over, who, independently of his martyrdom, had much to teach, and that what he did while he lived should be hidden from the world. And indeed, these doings of his were such and so great and so admirable that I am deterred by the contemplation of their greatness, and confess myself incompetent to discourse in a way that shall be worthy of the honor of his deserts, and unable to relate such noble deeds in such a way that they may appear as great as in fact they are, except that the multitude of his glories is itself sufficient for itself, and needs no other heraldry. It enhances my difficulty that you also are anxious to hear very much, or if it be possible, everything about him, longing with eager warmth, at least, to become acquainted with his deeds, although now his living words are silent. And in this behalf, if I should say that the powers of eloquence fail me, I should say too little. For eloquence itself fails of suitable powers fully to satisfy your desire, and thus I am sorely pressed on both sides, since he burdens me with his virtues, and you press me hard with your entreaties. At what point, then, shall I begin? From what direction shall I approach the description of his goodness, except from the beginning of his faith and from his heavenly birth? Inasmuch as the doings of a man of God should not be reckoned from any point except from the time that he was born of God. He may have had pursuits previously, and liberal arts may have imbued his mind while engaged therein, but these things I pass over, for as yet they had nothing to do with anything but his secular advantage. But when he had learned sacred knowledge, and breaking through the clouds of this world, had emerged into the light of spiritual wisdom, if I was with him in any of his doings, if I have discerned any of his more illustrious labors, I will speak of them, only asking, meanwhile, for this indulgence, that whatever I shall say too little, for too little I must needs say, may rather be attributed to my ignorance than subtracted from his glory. While his faith was in its first rudiments, he believed that before God nothing was worthy in comparison of the observance of continency, for he thought that the heart might then become what it ought to be, and the mind attain to the full capacity of truth, if he trod under foot the lust of the flesh with the robust and healthy vigor of holiness. Who has ever recorded such a marvel? His second birth had not yet enlightened the new man with the entire splendor of the divine light, yet he was already overcoming the ancient and pristine darkness by the mere dawning of the light. Then, what is even greater, when he had learned from the reading of Scripture certain things not according to the condition of his novitiate, but in proportion to the earliness of his faith, he immediately laid hold of what he had discovered for his own advantage in deserving well of God. By distributing his means for the relief of the indigence of the poor, by dispensing the purchase money of entire estates, he at once realized two benefits: the contempt of this world's ambition, than which nothing is more pernicious, and the observance of that mercy which God has preferred even to his sacrifices, and which even he did not maintain, who said that he had kept all the commandments of the law, whereby, with premature swiftness of piety, he almost began to be perfect before he had learnt the way to be perfect. Who of the ancients, I pray, has done this? Who of the most celebrated veterans in the faith, whose hearts and ears have throbbed to the divine words for many years, has attempted any such thing as this man of faith, yet unskilled, and whom, perhaps, as yet nobody trusted, surpassing the age of antiquity, accomplished by his glorious and admirable labors? No one reaps immediately upon his sowing. No one presses out the vintage harvest from the trenches just formed. No one ever yet sought for ripened fruit from newly planted slips. But in him all incredible things concurred. In him the threshing preceded, if it may be said, for the thing is beyond belief, preceded the sowing, the vintage, the shoots, the fruit, the root. The Apostles' Epistle says that novices should be passed over, lest by the stupor of heathenism that clings to their yet unconfirmed minds, their untaught inexperience should in any respect sin against God. He first, and I think he alone, furnished an illustration that greater progress is made by faith than by time. For although in the Acts of the Apostles the eunuch is described as at once baptized by Philip because he believed with his whole heart, this is not a fair parallel. For he was a Jew, and as he came from the temple of the Lord, he was reading the prophet Isaiah, and he hoped in Christ, although as yet he did not believe that he had come, while the other, coming from the ignorant heathens, began with a faith as mature as that with which few perhaps have finished their course. In short, in respect of God's grace, there was no delay, no postponement. I have said but little. He immediately received the presbyteriate and the priesthood. For who is there that would not entrust every grade of honor to one who believed with such a disposition? There are many things which he did while still a layman, and many things which now as a presbyter he did, many things which, after the examples of righteous men of old, and following them with a close imitation, he accomplished with the obedience of entire consecration, that deserved well of the Lord. For his discourse concerning this was usually, that if he had read of any one being set forth with the praise of God, he would persuade us to inquire on account of what doings he had pleased God. If Job, glorious by God's testimony, was called a true worshipper of God, and one to whom there was none upon earth to be compared, he taught that we should do whatever Job had previously done, so that while we were doing like things, we may call forth a similar testimony of God for ourselves. He, contemning the loss of his estate, gained such advantage by his virtue thus tried, that he had no perception of the temporal losses even of his affection. Neither poverty nor pain broke him down. The persuasion of his wife did not influence him. The dreadful suffering of his own body did not shake his firmness. His virtue remained established in its own home, and his devotion, founded upon deep roots, gave way under no onset of the devil, tempting him to abstain from blessing his God with a grateful faith even in his adversity. His house was open to every comer. No widow returned from him with an empty lap. No blind man was unguided by him as a companion. None faltering in step was unsupported by him for a staff. None stripped of help by the hand of the mighty was not protected by him as a defender. Such things ought they to do. He was accustomed to say who desired to please God, and thus running through the examples of all good men, by always imitating those who were better than others, he made himself also worthy of imitation. He had a close association among us with a just man, and of praiseworthy memory, by name Cæcilius, and in age as well as in honor a presbyter, who had converted him from his worldly errors to the acknowledgment of the true divinity. This man he loved with entire honor and all observance, regarding him with an obedient veneration, not only as the friend and comrade of his soul, but as the parent of his new life. And at length he, influenced by his attentions, was, as well he might be, stimulated to such a pitch of excessive love, that when he was departing from this world, and his summons was at hand, he commended to him his wife and children, so that him whom he had made a partner in the fellowship of his way of life, he afterwards made the heir of his affection. It would be tedious to go through individual circumstances. It would be laborious to enumerate all his doings. For the proof of his good works, I think that this one thing is enough, that by the judgment of God and the favor of the people, he was chosen to the office of the priesthood and the degree of the episcopate, while still a neophyte, and, as it was considered, a novice. Although still in the early days of his faith, and in the untaught season of his spiritual life, a generous disposition so shone forth in him, that although not yet resplendent with the glitter of office, but only of hope, he gave promise of entire trustworthiness for the priesthood that was coming upon him. Moreover, I will not pass over that remarkable fact of the way in which, when the entire people by God's inspiration leapt forward in his love and honor, he humbly withdrew, giving place to men of older standing, and thinking himself unworthy of a claim to so great honor, so that he thus became more worthy. For he is made more worthy who dispenses with what he deserves. And with this excitement were the eager people at that time inflamed, desiring with a spiritual longing, as the event proved, not only a bishop, for in him, whom then was a latent foreboding of divinity, they were in such wise demanding, they were seeking not only a priest, but moreover a future martyr. A crowded fraternity was besieging the doors of the house, and throughout all the avenues of access an anxious love was circulating. Possibly that apostolic experience might then have happened to him as he desired, of being let down through a window, had he also been equal to the apostle in the honor of ordination. It was plain to be seen that all the rest were expecting his coming with an anxious spirit of suspense, and received him when he came with excessive joy. I speak unwillingly, but I must needs speak. Some resisted him, even that he might overcome them, yet with what gentleness, how patiently, how benevolently he gave them indulgence, how mercifully he forgave them, reckoning them afterwards to the astonishment of many among his closest and most intimate friends. For who would not be amazed at the forgetfulness of a mind so retentive? Henceforth, who is sufficient to relate the manner in which he bore himself? What piety was his? What vigor? How great his mercy? How great his strictness? So much sanctity and grace beamed from his face that it confounded the minds of the beholders. His countenance was grave and joyous. Neither was his severity gloomy, nor his affability excessive, but a mingled tempering of both, so that it might be doubted whether he most deserved to be revered or to be loved, except that he deserved both, to be revered and to be loved. And his dress was not out of harmony with his countenance, being itself also subdued to a fitting mien. The pride of the world did not inflame him, nor yet did an excessively affected penury make him sordid, because this latter kind of attire arises no less from boastfulness than does such an ambitious frugality from ostentation. But what did he, as bishop in respect of the poor, whom as a catechumen he had loved? Let the priests of piety consider, or those whom the teaching of their very rank has trained to the duty of good works, or those whom the common obligation of the sacrament has bound to the duty of manifesting love. Cyprian, the bishop's throne, received such as he had been before. It did not make him so, and therefore for such merits he at once obtained the glory of prescription also. For nothing else was proper than that he who, in the secret recesses of his conscience, was rich in the full honor of religion and faith, should moreover be renowned in the publicly diffused report of the Gentiles. He might, indeed, at that time, in accordance with the rapidity wherewith he always attained everything, have hastened to the crown of martyrdom appointed for him, especially when with repeated calls he was frequently demanded for the lions, had it not been needful for him to pass through all the grades of glory, and thus to arrive at the highest, and had not the impending desolation needed the aid of so fertile a mind. For conceive of him as being at that time taken away by the dignity of martyrdom. Who was there to show the advantage of grace advancing by faith? Who was there to restrain virgins to the fitting discipline of modesty and a dress worthy of holiness, as if with a kind of bridle of the lessons of the Lord? Who was there to teach penitence to the lapsed, truth to heretics, unity to schismatics, peacefulness and the law of evangelical prayer to the sons of God? By whom were the blaspheming Gentiles to be overcome by retorting upon themselves the accusations which they heap upon us? By whom were Christians of too tender an affection, or, what is of more importance, of a too feeble faith in respect of the loss of their friends, to be consoled with the hope of futurity? Whence should we so learn mercy? Whence patience? Who was there to restrain the ill blood arising from the envenomed malignity of envy with the sweetness of a wholesome remedy? Who was there to raise up such great martyrs by the exhortation of his divine discourse? Who was there, in short, to animate so many confessors sealed with a second inscription on their distinguished brows, and reserved alive for an example of martyrdom, kindling their ardor with the heavenly trumpet? Fortunately, it occurred then, and truly by the Spirit's direction, that the man who was needed for so many and so excellent purposes was withheld from the consummation of martyrdom. Do you wish to be assured that the cause of his withdrawal was not fear? To allege nothing else, he did suffer subsequently, and this suffering he assuredly would have evaded as usual if he had evaded it before. It was indeed that fear, and rightly so, that fear which would dread to offend the Lord, that fear which prefers to obey God's commands rather than to be crowned in disobedience. For a mind dedicated in all things to God, and thus enslaved to the divine admonitions, believed that even in suffering itself it would sin, unless it had obeyed the Lord, who then bade him seek the place of concealment. Moreover, I think that something may here be said about the benefit of the delay, although I have already touched slightly on the matter. By what appears subsequently to have occurred, it follows that we may prove that withdrawal was not conceived by human pusillanimity, but, as indeed is the case, was truly divine. The usual and violent rage of a cruel persecution had laid waste God's people, and since the artful enemy could not deceive all by one fraud, wherever the incautious soldier laid bare his side, there in various manifestations of rage he had destroyed individuals with different kinds of overthrow. There needed someone who could, when men were wounded and hurt by the various art of the attacking enemy, use the remedy of the celestial medicine according to the nature of the wound, either for cutting or for cherishing them. A man was preserved of an intelligence, besides other excellences, also spiritually trained, who between the resounding waves of the opposing schisms could steer the middle course of the church in a steady path. Are not such plans, I ask, divine? Could this have been done without God? Let them consider who think that such things as these can happen by chance. To them the church replies with clear voice, saying, I do not allow and do not believe that such needful men are reserved without the decree of God. Still, if it seem well, let me glance at the rest. Afterwards, there broke out a dreadful plague, and excessive destruction of a hateful disease invaded every house in succession of the trembling populace, carrying off day by day with abrupt attack numberless people, every one from his own house. All were shuddering, fleeing, shunning the contagion, impiously exposing their own friends, as if, with the exclusion of the person who was sure to die of the plague, one could exclude death itself also. There lay about the meanwhile over the whole city no longer bodies, but the carcasses of many, and, by the contemplation of a lot which in their turn would be theirs, demanded the pity of the passers-by for themselves. No one regarded anything besides his cruel gains. No one trembled at the remembrance of a similar event. No one did to another what he himself wished to experience. In these circumstances, it would be a wrong to pass over what the pontiff of Christ did, who excelled the pontiffs of the world as much in kindly affection as he did in truth of religion. On the people assembled together in one place, he first of all urged the benefits of mercy, teaching by examples from divine lessons how greatly the duties of benevolence avail to deserve well of God. Then afterwards he subjoined that there was nothing wonderful in our cherishing our own people only with the needed attentions of love, but that he might become perfect who would do something more than the publican or the heathen, who, overcoming evil with good, and practicing a clemency which was like the divine clemency, loved even his enemies, who would pray for the salvation of those that persecute him, as the Lord admonishes and exhorts. God continually makes his sun to rise, and from time to time gives showers to nourish the seed, exhibiting all these kindnesses not only to his people, but to aliens also. And if a man professes to be a son of God, why does not he imitate the example of his father? It becomes us, said he, to answer to our birth, and it is not fitting that those who are evidently born of God should be degenerate, but rather that the propagation of a good father should be proved in his offspring by the emulation of his goodness. I omit many other matters, and, indeed, many important ones, which the necessity of a limited space does not permit to be detailed in more lengthened discourse, and concerning which this much is sufficient to have been said. But if the Gentiles could have heard these things as they stood before the rostrum, they would probably at once have believed. What then should a Christian people do, whose very name proceeds from faith? Thus the ministrations are constantly distributed according to the quality of the men and their degrees. Many who, by the straitness of poverty, were unable to manifest the kindness of wealth, manifest more than wealth, making up by their own labor a service dearer than all riches. And under such a teacher who would not press forward to be found in some parts of such a warfare, whereby he might please both God the Father and Christ the Judge, and for the present so excellent a priest. Thus what is good was done in the liberality of overflowing works to all men, not to those only who are of the household of faith. Something more was done than is recorded of the incomparable benevolence of Tobias. He must forgive and forgive again, and frequently forgive, or, to speak more truly, he must of right concede that, although very much might be done before Christ, yet that something more might be done after Christ, since to his times all fullness is attributed. Tobias collected together those who were slain by the king and cast out, of his own race only. Banishment followed these actions, so good and so benevolent, for impiety always makes this return, that it repays the better with the worse. And what God's priests replied to the interrogation of the proconsul, there are acts which relate. In the meantime, he is excluded from the city who had done some good for the city's safety, he who had striven that the eyes of the living should not suffer the horrors of the infernal abode. He, I say, who vigilant in the watches of benevolence had provided, O wickedness, with unacknowledged goodness, that when all were forsaking the desolate appearance of the city, a destitute state and a deserted country should not perceive its many exiles. But let the world look to this, which accounts banishment a penalty. To them, their country is too dear, and they have the same name as their parents. But we abhor even our parents themselves if they would persuade us against God. To them, it is a severe punishment to live outside their own city. To the Christian, the whole of this world is one home. Wherefore, though he were banished into a hidden and secret place, yet associated with the affairs of his God, he cannot regard it as an exile. In addition, while honestly serving God, he is a stranger even in his own city. For while the continency of the Holy Spirit restrains him from carnal desires, he lays aside the conversation of the former man, and even among his fellow citizens, or, I might also say, among the parents themselves of his earthly life, he is a stranger. Besides, although this might otherwise appear to be a punishment, yet in causes and sentences of this kind, which we suffer for the trial of the proof of our virtue, it is not a punishment because it is a glory. But indeed, suppose banishment not to be a punishment to us, yet the witness of their own conscience may still attribute the last and worst wickedness to those who can lay upon the innocent what they think to be a punishment. I will not now describe a charming place, and, for the present, I pass over the addition of all possible delights. Let us conceive of the place, filthy in situation, squalid in appearance, having no wholesome water, no pleasantness of verdure, no neighboring shore, but vast wooded rocks between the inhospitable jaws of a totally deserted solitude, far removed in the pathless regions of the world. Such a place might have borne the name of exile, if Cyprian, the priest of God, had come thither, although to him, if the ministrations of men had been wanting, either birds, as in the case of Elias, or angels, as in that of Daniel, would have ministered. Away with the belief that anything would be wanting to the least of us, so long as he stands for the confession of the name. So far was God's pontiff, who had always been urgent in merciful works, from needing the assistance of all these things. And now let us return with thankfulness to what I had suggested in the second place, that for the soul of such a man there was divinely provided a sunny and suitable spot, a dwelling, secret as he wished, and all that has before been promised to be added to those who seek the kingdom and righteousness of God, and, not to mention, the number of the brethren who visited him, and then the kindness of the citizens themselves, which supplied to him everything whereof he appeared to be deprived. I will not pass over God's wonderful visitation, whereby he wished his priest to be so certain in exile of his passion that was to follow, that in his full confidence of the threatening martyrdom, Cherubis possessed not only an exile, but a martyr too. For on that day whereon we first abode in the place of banishment, for the condensation of his love had chosen me among his household companions to be a voluntary exile, would that he could also have chosen me to share his passion. There appeared to me, said he, ere yet I was sunk in the repose of slumber, a young man of unusual stature, who, as it were, led me to the praetorium, where I seemed to myself to be led before the tribunal of the proconsul then sitting. When he looked upon me, he began at once to note down a sentence on his tablet, which I knew not, for he had asked nothing of me with the accustomed interrogation. But the youth, who was standing at his back, very anxiously read what had been noted down, and because he could not then declare it in words, he showed me by an intelligible sign what was contained in the writing of that tablet. For, with hand expanded and flattened like a blade, he imitated the stroke of an accustomed punishment and expressed what he wished to be understood as clearly as by speech. I understood the future sentence of my passion. I began to ask and beg immediately that a delay of at least 1 day should be accorded me, until I should have arranged my property in some reasonable order. And when I had urgently repeated my entreaty, he began again to note down, I know not what, on his tablet. But I perceived from the calmness of his countenance that the judge's mind was moved by my petition as being a just one. Moreover, that youth, who already had disclosed to me the intelligence of my passion by gesture rather than by words, hastened to signify repeatedly by secret signal that the delay was granted which had been asked for until the morrow, twisting his fingers one behind the other. And I, although the sentence had not been read, although I rejoiced with very glad heart with joy at the delay accorded, yet trembled so with fear of the uncertainty of the interpretation, that the remains of fear still set my exulting heart beating with excessive agitation. What could be more plain than this revelation? What could be more blessed than this condensation? Everything was foretold to him beforehand, which subsequently followed. Nothing was diminished of the words of God, nothing was mutilated of so sacred a promise. Carefully consider each particular in accordance with its announcement. He asks for delay till the morrow, when the sentence of his passion was being deliberated on, begging that he might arrange his affairs on the day which he had thus obtained. This 1 day signified a year, which he was about to pass in the world after his vision. For, to speak more plainly, on that day, after the year was expired, he was crowned, on which, at the commencement of the year, the fact had been announced to him. For although we do not read of the day of the Lord as a year in the sacred scriptures, yet we regard that space of time as due in making promise of future things. Whence it is of no consequence if, in this case, under the ordinary expression of a day, it is only a year, that in this place is implied, because that which is the greater ought to be fuller in meaning. Moreover, that it was explained rather by signs than by speech, was because the utterance of speech was reserved for the manifestation of the time itself. For anything is usually set forth in words whenever what is set forth is accomplished. For indeed, no one knew why this had been shown to him until afterwards, when, on the very day on which he had seen it, he was crowned. Nevertheless, in the meantime, his impending suffering was certainly known by all, but the exact day of his passion was not spoken of by any of the same, just as if they were ignorant of it. And, indeed, I find something similar in the Scriptures. For Zacharias the priest, because he did not believe the promise of his son made to him by the angel, became dumb, so that he asked for tablets by a sign, being about to write his son's name rather than utter it. With reason, also, in this case, where God's messenger declared the impending passion of his priest rather by signs, he both admonished his faith and fortified his priest. Moreover, the ground of asking for delay arose out of his wish to arrange his affairs and settle his will. Yet what affairs or what will had he to arrange except ecclesiastical concerns? And thus that last delay was received in order that whatever had to be disposed of by his final decision concerning the care of cherishing the poor might be arranged. And I think that for no other reason, indeed for this reason only, indulgence was granted to him even by those very persons who had ejected and were about to slay him, that, being at hand, he might relieve the poor also who were before him with the final, or, to speak more accurately, with the entire outlay of his last stewardship. And therefore, having so benevolently ordered matters, and so arranged them according to his will, the morrow drew near. Now, also a messenger came to him from the city, from Sixtus, the good and peacemaking priest, and on that account the most blessed martyr. The coming executioner was instantly looked for, who should strike through that devoted neck of the most sacred victim, and thus, in the daily expectation of dying, every day was to him as if the crown might be attributed to each. In the meantime, there assembled to him many eminent people, and people of most illustrious rank and family, and noble with the world's distinctions, who, on account of ancient friendship with him, repeatedly urged his withdrawal, and that their urgency might not be in some sort hollow, they also offered places to which he might retire. But he had now set the world aside, having his mind suspended upon heaven, and did not consent to their tempting persuasions. He would perhaps even then have done what was being asked for by so many and faithful friends, if it had been bidden him by divine command. But that lofty glory of so great a man must not be passed over without announcement, that now, when the world was swelling, and of its trust in its princes, breathing out hatred of the name, he was instructing God's servants as opportunity was given in the exhortations of the Lord, and was animating them to tread underfoot the sufferings of this present time by the contemplation of a glory to come hereafter. Indeed, such was his love of sacred discourse, that he wished that his prayers in regard to his suffering might be so answered that he would be put to death in the very act of speaking about God. And these were the daily acts of a priest destined for a pleasing sacrifice to God, when, behold, at the bidding of the proconsul, the officer with his soldiers on a sudden came unexpectedly on him, or rather, to speak more truly, thought that he had come unexpectedly on him at his gardens, I say, which at the beginning of his faith he had sold, and which, being restored by God's mercy, he would assuredly have sold again for the use of the poor, if he had not wished to avoid ill will from the persecutors. But when could a mind ever prepared be taken unawares, as if by an unforeseen attack? Therefore, now he went forward, certain that what had been long delayed would be settled. He went forward with a lofty and elevated mien, manifesting cheerfulness in his look and courage in his heart. But being delayed to the morrow, he returned from the praetorium to the officer's house, when on a sudden a scattered rumor prevailed throughout all Carthage that now Thascius was brought forward, whom there was nobody who did not know as well for his illustrious fame in the honorable opinion of all, as on account of the recollection of his most renowned work. On all sides all men were flocking together to a spectacle, to us glorious from the devotion of faith, and to be mourned over even by the Gentiles. A gentle custody, however, had him in charge when taken and placed for one night in the officer's house, so that we, his associates and friends, were as usual in his company. The whole people, in the meantime, in anxiety that nothing should be done throughout the night without their knowledge, kept watch before the officer's door. The goodness of God granted him at that time so truly worthy of it that even God's people should watch on the passion of the priest. Yet, perhaps, some one may ask what was the reason of his returning from the praetorium to the officer, and some think that this arose from the fact that for his own part the proconsul was then unwilling. Far be it from me to complain in matters divinely ordered of slothfulness or aversion in the proconsul. Far be it from me to admit such an evil into the consciousness of a religious mind, as that the fancy of man should decide the fate of so blessed a martyr. But the morrow, which a year before the divine condensation had foretold, required to be literally the morrow, and hence the respite. At last, that other day dawned, that destined, that promised, that divine day, which, if even the tyrant himself had wished to put off, he would not have had any power to do so, the day rejoicing at the consciousness of the future martyr, and, the clouds being scattered throughout the circuit of the world, the day shone upon with a brilliant sun. He went out from the house of the officer, though he was the officer of Christ and God, and was walled in on all sides by the ranks of a mingled multitude. And such a numberless army hung upon his company, as if they had come with an assembled troop to assault death itself. Now, as he went, he had to pass by the race course, and rightly, and as if it had been contrived on purpose, he had to pass by the place of a corresponding struggle, who, having finished his contest, was running to the crown of righteousness. But when he had come to the praetorium, as the proconsul had not yet come forth, a place of retirement was accorded him. There, as he sat moistened after his long journey with excessive perspiration, the seat was by chance covered with linen, so that even in the very moment of his passion he might enjoy the honor of the episcopate. One of the officers, Thascius, who had formerly been a Christian, offered him his clothes, as if he might wish to change his moistened garments for drier ones, and he doubtless coveted nothing further in respect of his proffered kindness than to possess the now blood-stained sweat of the martyr going to God. He made reply to him and said, "We apply medicines to annoyances which probably today will no longer exist." Is it any wonder that he despised suffering in body who had despised death in soul? Why should we say more? He was suddenly announced to the proconsul. He is brought forward. He is placed before him. He is interrogated as to his name. He answers who he is, and nothing more. And thus, therefore, the judge reads from his tablet the sentence which lately in the vision he had not read, a spiritual sentence, not rashly to be spoken, a sentence worthy of such a bishop and such a witness, a glorious sentence wherein he was called a standard-bearer of the sect and an enemy of the gods, and one who was to be an example to his people, and that with his blood discipline would begin to be established. Nothing could be more complete, nothing more true than the sentence. For all the things which were said, although said by a heathen, are divine, nor is it indeed to be wondered at, since priests are accustomed to prophesy of the passion. He had been a standard-bearer who was accustomed to teach concerning the bearing of Christ's standard. He had been an enemy of the gods who commanded the idols to be destroyed. Moreover, he gave example to his friends, since when many were about to follow in a similar manner, he was the first in the province to consecrate the first fruits of martyrdom, and by his blood discipline began to be established, but it was the discipline of martyrs, who, emulating their teacher in the imitation of a glory like his own, themselves also gave a confirmation to discipline by the very blood of their own example. And when he left the doors of the praetorium, a crowd of soldiery accompanied him, and that nothing might be wanting in his passion, centurions and tribunes guarded his side. Now the place itself where he was about to suffer is level, so that it affords a noble spectacle, with its trees thickly planted on all sides. But as, by the extent of the space beyond, the view was not attainable to the confused crowd, persons who favored him had climbed up into the branches of the trees, that there might not even be wanting to him what happened in the case of Zacchaeus, that he was gazed upon from the trees. And now, having with his own hands bound his eyes, he tried to hasten the slowness of the executioner, whose office was to wield the sword, and who with difficulty clasped the blade in his failing right hand with trembling fingers, until the mature hour of glorification strengthened the hand of the centurion with power granted from above to accomplish the death of the excellent man, and at length supplied him with the permitted strength. O blessed people of the Church, who as well in sight as in feeling, and, what is more, in outspoken words, suffered with such a bishop as theirs, and, as they had ever judged him in his own discourses, were crowned by God the Judge. For although that which the general wish desired could not occur, viz., that the entire congregation should suffer at once in the fellowship of a like glory, yet whoever, under the eyes of Christ beholding, and in the hearing of the priest, eagerly desired to suffer, by the sufficient testimony of that desire, did in some sort send a missive to God as his ambassador. His passion being thus accomplished, it resulted that Cyprian, who had been an example to all good men, was also the first who in Africa imbued his priestly crown with blood of martyrdom, because he was the first who began to be such after the apostles. For, from the time at which the episcopal order is enumerated at Carthage, not one is ever recorded, even of good men and priests, to have come to suffering. Although devotion surrendered to God is always in consecrated men reckoned instead of martyrdom, yet Cyprian attained even to the perfect crown by the consummation of the Lord, so that in that very city in which he had in such wise lived, and in which he had been the first to do many noble deeds, he also was the first to decorate the insignia of his heavenly priesthood with glorious gore. What shall I do now? Between joy at his passion and grief at still remaining, my mind is divided in different directions, and twofold affections are burdening a heart too limited for them. Shall I grieve that I was not his associate? But yet I must triumph in his victory. Shall I triumph at his victory? Still I grieve that I am not his companion. Yet still to you I must in simplicity confess, what you also are aware of, that it was my intention to be his companion. Much and excessively I exult at his glory, but still more do I grieve that I remain behind. End of the Life and Passion of Cyprian, Bishop and Martyr, by Pontius the Deacon. Read by David Ronald. Epistle 1. To Donatus. Argument. Cyprian had promised Donatus that he would have a discourse with him concerning things divine, and now being reminded of his promise, he fulfills it. Commending at length the grace of God conferred in baptism, he declares how he had been changed thereby, and, finally, pointing out the errors of the world, he exhorts to contempt of it, and to reading and prayer. Cæcilius Cyprian, to Donatus, sends greeting. You rightly remind me, dearest Donatus, for I not only remember my promise, but I confess that this is the appropriate time for its fulfillment, when the vintage festival invites the mind to unbend in repose and to enjoy the annual and appointed respite of the declining year. Moreover, the place is in accord with the season, and the pleasant aspect of the gardens harmonizes with the gentle breezes of a mild autumn in soothing and cheering the senses. In such a place as this, it is delightful to pass the day in discourse, and, by the study of the sacred narratives, to train the conscience of the breast to the apprehension of the divine precepts, and that no profane intruder may interrupt our converse, nor any unrestrained clatter of a noisy household disturb it, let us seek this bower. The neighboring thickets ensure us solitude, and the vagrant trailings of the vine branches creeping in pendant mazes among the reeds that support them have made for us a porch of vines and a leafy shelter. Pleasantly, here we clothe our thoughts in words, and while we gratify our eyes with the agreeable outlook upon trees and vines, the mind is at once instructed by what we hear and nourished by what we see, although, at the present time, your only pleasure and your only interest is in our discourse. Despising the other pleasures of sight, your eye is now fixed on me. With your mind as well as your ears, you are altogether a listener, and a listener, too, with an eagerness proportioned to your affection. And yet, of what kind or of what amount is anything that my mind is likely to communicate to yours? The poor mediocrity of my shallow understanding produces a very limited harvest, and enriches the soil with no fruitful deposits. Nevertheless, with such powers as I have, I will set about the matter, for the subject itself on which I am about to speak will assist me. In courts of justice, in the public assembly, in political debate, a copious eloquence may be the glory of a voluble ambition, but in speaking of the Lord God, a chaste simplicity of expression strives for the conviction of faith rather with the substance than with the powers of eloquence. Therefore, accept from me things, not clever, but weighty, words not decked up to charm a popular audience with cultivated rhetoric, but simple and fitted by their unvarnished truthfulness for the proclamation of the divine mercy. Accept what is felt before it is spoken, what has not been accumulated with tardy painstaking during the lapse of years, but has been inhaled in one breath of ripening grace. While I was still lying in darkness and gloomy night, wavering hither and thither, tossed about on the foam of this boastful age, and uncertain of my wandering steps, knowing nothing of my real life, and remote from truth and light, I used to regard it as a difficult matter, and especially as difficult in respect of my character at that time, that a man should be capable of being born again, a truth which the divine mercy had announced for my salvation, and that a man quickened to a new life in the laver of saving water should be able to put off what he had previously been, and although retaining all his bodily structure, should be himself changed in heart and soul. How, said I, is such a conversion possible, that there should be a sudden and rapid divestment of all which, either innate in us has hardened in the corruption of our material nature, or acquired by us has become inveterate by long accustomed use? These things have become deeply and radically ingrained within us. When does he learn thrift who has been used to liberal banquets and sumptuous feasts? And he who has been glittering in gold and purple, and has been celebrated for his costly attire, when does he reduce himself to ordinary and simple clothing? One who has felt the charm of the fasces and of civic honors shrinks from becoming a mere private and inglorious citizen. The man who is attended by crowds of clients and dignified by the numerous association of an officious train regards it as a punishment when he is alone. It is inevitable, as it ever has been, that the love of wine should entice, pride inflate, anger inflame, covetousness disquiet, cruelty stimulate, ambition delight, lust hasten to ruin, with allurements that will never let go their hold. These were my frequent thoughts, for as I myself was held in bonds by the innumerable errors of my previous life, from which I did not believe that I could by possibility be delivered, so I was disposed to my acquiesce in my clinging vices, and because I despaired of better things, I used to indulge my sins as if they were actually parts of me and indigenous to me. But after that, by the help of the water of the new birth, the stain of former years had been washed away, and a light from above, serene and pure, had been infused into my reconciled heart. After that, by the agency of the Spirit breathed from heaven, a second birth had restored me to a new man. Then, in a wondrous manner, doubtful things at once began to assure themselves to me, hidden things to be revealed, dark things to be enlightened. What before had seemed difficult began to suggest a means of accomplishment. What had been thought impossible to be capable of being achieved, so that I was enabled to acknowledge that what previously, being born of the flesh, had been living in the practice of sins, was of the earthly, but had now begun to be of God, and was animated by the Spirit of holiness. You yourself assuredly know and recollect as well as I do what was taken away from us, and what was given to us by that death of evil and that life of virtue. You yourself know this without my information. Anything like boasting in one's own praise is hateful, although we cannot, in reality, boast, but only be grateful for whatever we do not ascribe to man's virtue, but declare to be the gift of God, so that now we sin not is the beginning of the work of faith, whereas that we sinned before was the result of human error. All our power is of God, I say, of God. From him we have life, from him we have strength. By power derived and conceived from him we do, while yet in this world, foreknow the indications of things to come. Only let fear be the keeper of innocence, that the Lord, who of his mercy has flowed into our hearts in the access of celestial grace, may be kept by righteous submissiveness in the holstry of a grateful mind, that the assurance we have gained may not beget carelessness, and so the old enemy creep upon us again. But if you keep the way of innocence, the way of righteousness, if you walk with a firm and steady step, if depending on God with your whole strength and with your whole heart, you only be what you have begun to be, liberty and power to do is given you in proportion to the increase of your spiritual grace. For there is not, as is the case with earthly benefits, any measure of stint in the dispensing of the heavenly gift. The Spirit, freely flowing forth, is restrained by no limits, is checked by no closed barriers within certain bounded spaces. It flows perpetually. It is exuberant in its affluence. Let our heart only be athirst and be ready to receive, in the degree in which we bring to it a capacious faith. In that measure we draw from it an overflowing grace. Thence is given power, with modest chastity, with a sound mind, with a simple voice, with unblemished virtue, that is able to quench the virus of poisons for the healing of the sick, to purge out the stains of foolish souls by restored health, to bid peace to those that are at enmity, repose to the violent, gentleness to the unruly, by startling threats to force to avow themselves the impure and vagrant spirits that have betaken themselves into the bodies of men whom they purpose to destroy, to drive them with heavy blows to come out of them, to stretch them out, struggling, howling, groaning with increase of constantly renewing pain, to beat them with scourges, to roast them with fire. The matter is carried on there, but is not seen. The strokes inflicted are hidden, but the penalty is manifest. Thus, in respect of what we have already begun to be, the Spirit that we have received possesses its own liberty of action, while in that we have not yet changed our body and members, the carnal view is still darkened by the clouds of this world. How great is this empire of the mind, and what a power it has, not alone that itself is withdrawn from the mischievous associations of the world, as one who is purged and pure can suffer no stain of a hostile eruption, but that it becomes still greater and stronger in its might, so that it can rule over all the imperious host of the attacking adversary with its sway. But in order that the characteristics of the divine may shine more brightly by the development of the truth, I will give you light to apprehend it, the obscurity caused by sin being wiped away. I will draw away the veil from the darkness of this hidden world. For a brief space conceive yourself to be transported to one of the loftiest peaks of some inaccessible mountain, thence gaze on the appearances of things lying below you, and with eyes turned in various directions look upon the eddies of the billowy world, while you yourself are removed from earthly contacts. You will at once begin to feel compassion for the world, and with self-recollection and increasing gratitude to God, you will rejoice with all the greater joy that you have escaped it. Consider the roads blocked up by robbers, the seas beset with pirates, wars scattered all over the earth with the bloody horror of camps. The whole world is wet with mutual blood and murder, which in the case of an individual is admitted to be a crime, is called a virtue when it is committed wholesale. Impunity is claimed for the wicked deeds, not on the plea that they are guiltless, but because the cruelty is perpetrated on a grand scale. And now, if you turn your eyes and your regards to the cities themselves, you will behold a concourse more fraught with sadness than any solitude. The gladiatorial games are prepared, that blood may gladden the lust of cruel eyes. The body is fed up with stronger food, and the vigorous mass of limbs is enriched with brawn and muscle, that the wretch fattened for punishment may die a harder death. Man is slaughtered that man may be gratified, and the skill that is best able to kill is an exercise and an art. Crime is not only committed, but it is taught. What can be said more inhuman? What more repulsive? Training is undergone to acquire the power to murder, and the achievement of murder is its glory. What state of things, I pray you, can that be, and what can it be like in which men, whom none have condemned, offer themselves to the wild beasts, men of ripe age, of sufficiently beautiful person, clad in costly garments? Living men, they are adorned for a voluntary death. Wretched men, they boast of their own miseries. They fight with beasts, not for their crime, but for their madness. Fathers look on their own sons. A brother is in the arena, and his sister is hard by. And although a grander display of pomp increases the price of the exhibition, yet, O shame! Even the mother will pay the increase in order that she may be present at her own miseries. And in looking upon scenes so frightful and so impious and so deadly, they do not seem to be aware that they are parricides with their eyes. Hence turn your looks to the abominations, not less to be deplored of another kind of spectacle. In the theatres also you will behold what may well cause you grief and shame. It is the tragic buskin which relates in verse the crimes of ancient days. The old horrors of parricide and incest are unfolded in action calculated to express the image of the truth, so that, as the ages pass by, any crime that was formerly committed may not be forgotten. Each generation is reminded by what it hears that whatever has once been done may be done again. Crimes never die out by the lapse of ages. Wickedness is never abolished by process of time. Impiety is never buried in oblivion. Things which have now ceased to be actual deeds of vice become examples. In the mimes, moreover, by the teaching of infamies, the spectator is attracted either to reconsider what he may have done in secret, or to hear what he may do. Adultery is learnt while it is seen, and while the mischief, having public authority, panders to vices, the matron, who perchance had gone to the spectacle a modest woman, returns from it immodest. Still further, what a degradation of morals it is, what a stimulus to abominable deeds, what food for vice, to be polluted by histrionic gestures against the covenant and law of one's birth, to gaze in detail upon the endurance of incestuous abominations. Men are emasculated, and all the pride and vigor of their sex is effeminated, in the disgrace of their enervated body, and he is most pleasing there who has most completely broken down the man into the woman. He grows into praise by virtue of his crime, and the more he is degraded, the more skillful he is considered to be. Such a one is looked upon, O shame, and looked upon with pleasure. And what can not such a creature suggest? He inflames the senses, he flatters the affections, he drives out the more vigorous conscience of a virtuous beast. Nor is there wanting authority for the enticing abomination that the mischief may creep upon people with a less perceptible approach. They picture Venus immodest, Mars adulterous, and that Jupiter of theirs not more supreme in dominion than in vice, inflamed with earthly love in the midst of his own thunders, now groaning white in the feathers of a swan, now pouring down in a golden shower, now breaking forth by the help of birds to violate the purity of boys. And now put the question, can he who looks upon such things be healthy-minded or modest? Men imitate the gods whom they adore, and to such miserable beings their crimes become their religion. Oh, if placed on that lofty watchtower you could gaze into the secret places, if you could open the closed doors of sleeping chambers and recall their dark recesses to the perception of sight, you would behold things done by immodest persons with no chaste eye could look upon. You would see what even to see is a crime. You would see what people imbruted with the madness of vice deny that they have done, and yet hasten to do. Men with frenzied lusts, rushing upon men, doing things which afford no gratification even to those who do them. I am deceived if the man who is guilty of such things as these does not accuse others of them. The depraved maligns the depraved, and thinks that he himself, though conscious of the guilt, has escaped, as if consciousness were not a sufficient condemnation. The same people who are accusers in public are criminals in private, condemning themselves at the same time as they condemn the culprits. They denounce abroad what they commit at home, willingly doing what, when they have done, they accuse, a daring which assuredly is fitly mated with vice, and an impudence quite in accordance with shameless people. And I beg you not to wonder at the things that persons of this kind speak. The offense of their mouths in words is the least of which they are guilty. But after considering the public roads full of pitfalls, after battles of many kinds scattered abroad over the whole world, after exhibitions either bloody or infamous, after the abominations of lust, whether exposed for sale in brothels or hidden within the domestic walls, abominations, the audacity of which is greater in proportion to the secrecy of the crime, possibly you may think that the forum at least is free from such things, that it is neither exposed to exasperating wrongs nor polluted by the association of criminals. Then turn your gaze in that direction. There you will discover things more odious than ever, so that thence you will be more desirous of turning away your eyes, although the laws are carved on 12 tables, and the statutes are publicly prescribed on brazen tablets. Yet wrong is done in the midst of the laws themselves. Wickedness is committed in the very face of the statutes. Innocence is not preserved even in the place where it is defended. By turns the rancor of disputants rages, and when peace is broken among the togas, the forum echoes with the madness of strife. There close at hand is the spear and the sword, and the executioner also. There is the claw that tears, the rack that stretches, the fire that burns up. More tortures for one poor human body than it has limbs, and in such cases who is there to help? One's patron? He makes a feint and deceives. The judge? But he sells his sentence. He who sits to avenge crimes commits them, and the judge becomes the culprit in order that the accused may perish innocently. Crimes are everywhere common, and everywhere is the multiform character of sin. The pernicious poison acts by means of degraded minds. One man forges a will, another by a capital fraud makes a false deposition. On the one hand, children are cheated of their inheritances. On the other, strangers are endowed with their estates. The opponent makes his charge, the false accuser attacks, the witness defames. On all sides, the venal impudence of hired voices sets about the falsification of charges, while in the meantime the guilty do not even perish with the innocent. There is no fear about the laws, no concern for either inquisitor or judge. When the sentence can be bought off for money, it is not cared for. It is a crime now among the guilty to be innocent. Whoever does not imitate the wicked is an offense to them. The laws have come to terms with crimes, and whatever is public has begun to be allowed. What can be the modesty, what can be the integrity that prevails there, when there are none to condemn the wicked? The one only meets with those who ought themselves to be condemned. But that we may not perchance appear as if we were picking out extreme cases, and with the view of disparagement were seeking to attract your attention to those things whereof the sad and revolting view may offend the gaze of a better conscience, I will now direct you to such things as the world in its ignorance accounts good. Among these also you will behold things that will shock you, in respect of what you regard as honors, of what you consider the fasces, what you count affluence in riches, what you think power in the camp, the glory of the purple in the magisterial office, the power of license in the chief command. There is hidden the virus of ensnaring mischief, and an appearance of smiling wickedness, joyous indeed, but the treacherous deception of hidden calamity, just as some poison, in which the flavor, having been medicated with sweetness, craftily mingled in its deadly juices, seems, when taken, to be an ordinary draught, but when it is drunk up, the destruction that you have swallowed assails you. You see, forsooth, that man distinguished by his brilliant dress, glittering as he thinks in his purple. Yet with what baseness has he purchased this glitter? What contempts of the proud has he had first to submit to? What haughty thresholds has he, as an earthly courtier, besieged? How many scornful footsteps of arrogant great men has he had to precede, thronged in the crowd of clients, that by and by a similar procession might attend and precede him with salutations, a train waiting not upon his person, but upon his power. For he has no claim to be regarded for his character, but for his fasces. Of these, finally, you may see the degrading end, when the time-serving sycophant has departed, and the hanger-on, deserting them, has defiled and exposed side of the man who has retired into a private condition. It is then that the mischiefs done to the squandered family estate smite upon the conscience, then the losses that have exhausted the fortune are known, expenses by which the favor of the populace was bought, and the people's breath asked for with fickle and empty entreaties. Assuredly, it was a vain and foolish boastfulness to have desired to set forth in the gratification of a disappointing spectacle what the people would not receive and what would ruin the magistrates. But those, moreover, whom you consider rich, who add force to force, and who, excluding the poor from their neighborhood, stretch out their fields far and wide into space without any limits, who possess immense heaps of silver and gold and mighty sums of money, either in built-up heaps or in buried stores, even in the midst of their riches, those are torn to pieces by the anxiety of vague thought, lest the robber should spoil, lest the murderer should attack, lest the envy of some wealthier neighbor should become hostile and harass them with malicious lawsuits. Such an one enjoys no security, either in his food or in his sleep. In the midst of the banquet he sighs, although he drinks from a jeweled goblet. And when his luxurious bed has enfolded his body, languid with feasting in its yielding bosom, he lies wakeful in the midst of the down, nor does he perceive, poor wretch, that these things are merely gilded torments, that he is held in bondage by his gold, and that he is the slave of his luxury and wealth, rather than their master. And oh, the odious blindness of perception, and the deep darkness of senseless greed! Although he might disburden himself and get rid of the load, he rather continues to brood over his vexing wealth. He goes on obstinately clinging to his tormenting hoards. From him there is no liberality to dependents, no communication to the poor, and yet such people call that their own money, which they guard with jealous labor, shut up at home as if it were another's, and from which they derive no benefit either for their friends, for their children, or in fine, for themselves. Their possession amounts to this only, that they can keep others from possessing it. And oh, what a marvelous perversion of names! They called those things goods, which they absolutely put to none but bad uses. Or think you that even those are secure, that those at least are safe, with some stable permanence among the chaplets of honor and vast wealth, whom, in the glitter of royal palaces, the safeguard of watchful arms surrounds? On the contrary, they have greater fear than others. A man is constrained to dread no less than he is dreaded. Exaltation exacts its penalties equally from the more powerful, although he may be hedged in with bands of satellites, and may guard his person with the enclosure and protection of a numerous retinue. Even as he does not allow his inferiors to feel security, it is inevitable that he himself should want the sense of security. The power of those whom power makes terrible to others is, first of all, terrible to themselves. It smiles to rage, it cajoles to deceive, it entices to slay, it lifts up to cast down. With a certain usury of mischief, the greater the height of dignity and honors attained, the greater is the interest of penalty required. Hence, then, the one peaceful and trustworthy tranquillity, the one solid and firm constant security, is this: for a man to withdraw from these eddies of a distracting world, and, anchored on the ground of the harbor of salvation, to lift his eyes from earth to heaven, and having been admitted to the gift of God, and being already very near to his God in mind, he may boast that whatever in human affairs others esteem lofty and grand lies altogether beneath his consciousness. He who is actually greater than the world can crave nothing, can desire nothing from the world. How stable, how free from all the shocks is that safeguard, how heavenly the protection and its perennial blessings, to be loosed from the snares of this entangling world, and to be purged from earthly dregs, and fitted for the light of eternal immortality. He will see what crafty mischief of the foe that previously attacked us has been in progress against us. We are constrained to have more love for what we shall be, by being allowed to know and to condemn what we were. Neither for this purpose is it necessary to pay a price, either in the way of bribery or of labor, so that man's elevation or dignity or power should be begotten in him with elaborate effort. But it is a gratuitous gift from God, and it is accessible to all. As the sun shines spontaneously, as the day gives light, as the fountain flows, as the shower yields moisture, so does the heavenly Spirit infuse itself into us. When the soul, in its gaze into heaven, has recognized its author, it rises higher than the sun, and far transcends all this earthly power, and begins to be that which it believes itself to be. You, however, whom the celestial warfare has enlisted in the spiritual camp, only observe a discipline uncorrupted and chastened in the virtues of religion. Be constant as well in prayer as in reading. Now speak with God, now let God speak with you. Let him instruct you in his precepts, let him direct you. Whom he has made rich, none shall make poor, for, in fact, there can be no poverty to him whose breast has once been supplied with heavenly food. Ceilings enriched with gold, and houses adorned with mosaics of costly marble, will seem mean to you, now when you know that it is you yourself who are rather to be perfected, you who are rather to be adorned, and that dwelling in which God has dwelt, as in a temple, in which the Holy Spirit has begun to make his abode, is of more importance than all others. Let us embellish this house with the colors of innocence. Let us enlighten it with the light of justice. This will never fall into decay with the wear of age, nor shall it be defiled by the tarnishing of the colors of its walls, nor of its gold. Whatever is artificially beautified is perishing, and such things as contain not the reality of possession afford no abiding assurance to their possessors, but this remains in a beauty perpetually vivid, in perfect honor, in permanent splendor. It can neither decay nor be destroyed. It can only be fashioned into greater perfection when the body returns to it. These things, dearest Donatus, briefly for the present, for although what you profitably hear delights your patience, indulgent in its goodness, your well-balanced mind, and your assured faith, and nothing is so pleasant to your ears as what is pleasant to you in God, yet, as we are associated as neighbors and are likely to talk together frequently, we ought to have some moderation in our conversation, and since this is a holiday rest and a time of leisure, whatever remains of the day, now that the sun is sloping towards the evening, let us spend it in gladness, nor let even the hour of repast be without heavenly grace. Let the temperate meal resound with psalms, and as your memory is tenacious and your voice musical, undertake this office as is your wont. You will provide a better entertainment for your dearest friends, if, while we have something spiritual to listen to, the sweetness of religious music charm our ears. Epistle 2, from the Roman clergy to the Carthaginian clergy, about the retirement of the blessed Cyprian. Argument. The Roman clergy had learnt from Crementius, the subdeacon, that, in the time of persecution, Cyprian had withdrawn himself. Therefore, with their accustomed zeal for the faith, they remind the Carthaginian clergy of their duty and instruct them what to do in the case of the lapsed during the interval of the bishop's absence. We have been informed by Crementius, the subdeacon, who came to us from you, that the blessed Father Cyprian has for a certain reason withdrawn, in doing which he acted quite rightly, because he is a person of eminence, and because a conflict is impending, which God has allowed in the world for the sake of cooperating with his servants in their struggle against the adversary, and was, moreover, willing that this conflict should show to angels and to men that the victor shall be crowned, while the vanquished shall in himself receive the doom which has been made manifest to us. Since, moreover, it devolves upon us who appear to be placed on high in the place of a shepherd to keep watch over the flock. If we be found neglectful, it will be said to us, as it was said to our predecessors also, who in such wise negligent had been placed in charge, that we have not sought for that which was lost, and have not corrected the wanderer, and have not bound up that which was broken, but have eaten their milk, and have been clothed with their wool. And then also the Lord himself, fulfilling what had been written in the law and the prophets, teaches, saying, quote, I am the good shepherd, who lay down my life for the sheep. But the hireling, whose own the sheep are not, seeth the wolf coming, and leaveth the sheep, and fleeth, and the wolf scattereth them. End quote. To Simon, too, he speaks thus, quote, Lovest thou me? He answered, I do love thee. He saith to him, Feed my sheep. End quote. We know that this saying arose out of the very circumstance of his withdrawal, and the rest of the disciples did likewise. We are unwilling, therefore, beloved brethren, that you should be found hirelings, but we desire you to be good shepherds, since you are aware that no slight danger threatens you, if you do not exhort our brethren to stand steadfast in the faith, so that the brotherhood be not absolutely rooted out, as being of those who rush headlong into idolatry. Neither is it in words only that we exhort you to this, but you will be able to ascertain from very many who come to you from us that, God blessing us, we both have done and still do all these things ourselves with all anxiety and worldly risk, having before our eyes rather the fear of God and eternal sufferings than the fear of men and a short-lived discomfort, not forsaking the brethren, but exhorting them to stand firm in the faith and to be ready to go with the Lord. and we have even recalled those who were ascending to do that to which they were constrained. The church stands in faith, notwithstanding that some have been driven to fall by very terror, whether that they were persons of eminence or that they were afraid when seized with the fear of man. These, however, we did not abandon, although they were separated from us, but exhorted them, and do exhort them, to repent, if in any way they may receive pardon from him who is able to grant it, lest haply, if they should be deserted by us, they should become worse. You see, then, brethren, that you also ought to do the like, so that even those who have fallen may amend their minds by your exhortation, and if they should be seized once more, may confess, and may so make amends for their previous sin. And there are other matters which are incumbent on you, which also we have here added, as that if any who may have fallen into this temptation begin to be taken with sickness, and repent of what they have done, and desire communion, it should in any wise be granted to them. Or if you have widows or bedridden people who are unable to maintain themselves, or those who are in prisons or are excluded from their own dwellings, these ought in all cases to have some to minister to them. Moreover, catechumens, when seized with sickness, ought not to be deceived, but help is to be afforded to them. And as matter of the greatest importance, if the bodies of the martyrs and others be not buried, a considerable risk is incurred by those whose duty it is to do this office. But whomsoever of you, then, and on whatever occasion this duty may have been performed, we are sure that he is regarded as a good servant, as one who has been faithful in the least, and will be appointed ruler over 10 cities. May God, however, who gives all things to them that hope in him, grant to us that we may all be found in these works. The brethren who are in bonds greet you, as do the elders, and the whole church, which itself also with the deepest anxiety keeps watch over all who call on the name of the Lord. And we likewise beg you in your turn to have us in remembrance. Know, moreover, that Basanius has come to us, and we request of you, who have a zeal for God, to send a copy of this letter to whomsoever you are able, as occasions may serve, or make your own opportunities, or send a message, that they may stand firm and steadfast in the faith. We bid you, beloved brethren, ever heartily farewell. Epistle 3. To the presbyters and deacons abiding at Rome. Argument. This is a familiar and friendly epistle, so that it requires no formal argument, especially as it can be sufficiently gathered from the title itself. The letter of the Roman clergy to which Cyprian is replying is missing. Cyprian, to the elders and deacons, brethren, abiding at Rome, sends greeting. When the report of the departure of the excellent man, my colleague, was still uncertain among us, my beloved brethren, and I was wavering doubtfully in my opinion on the matter, I received a letter sent to me from you by Crementius, the subdeacon, in which I was most abundantly informed of his glorious end, and I rejoiced greatly that, in harmony with the integrity of his administration, an honorable consummation also attended him, wherein, moreover, I greatly congratulate you that you honor his memory with a testimony so public and so illustrious, so that by your means is made known to me not only what is glorious to you in connection with the memory of your bishop, but what ought to afford to me also an example of faith and virtue. For in proportion as the fall of a bishop is an event which tends ruinously to the fall of his followers, so on the other hand it is a useful and helpful thing when a bishop, by the firmness of his faith, sets himself forth to his brethren as an object of imitation. I have, moreover, read another epistle, in which neither the person who wrote nor the persons to whom it was written were plainly declared, and inasmuch as in the same letter both the writing and the matter, and even the paper itself, gave me the idea that something had been taken away or had been changed from the original, I have sent you back the epistle as it actually came to hand, that you may examine whether it is the very same which you gave to Cæcilius the subdeacon to carry. For it is a very serious thing if the truth of a clerical letter is corrupted by any falsehood or deceit. In order, then, that we may know this, ascertain whether the writing and subscription are yours, and write me again what is the truth of the matter. I bid you, dearest brethren, ever heartily farewell. Epistle 4. To the presbyters and deacons. Argument. Cyprian exhorts his clergy from his place of retirement, that in his absence they should be united, that nothing should be wanting to prisoners or to the rest of the poor, and further, that they should keep the people in quiet, lest, if they should rush in crowds to visit the martyrs in prison, this privilege should at length be forbidden them. Cyprian, to the presbyters and deacons, his beloved brethren, greeting. Being by the grace of God in safety, dearest brethren, I salute you, rejoicing that I am informed of the prosperity of all things in respect of your safety also, and as the condition of the place does not permit me to be with you now, I beg you, by your faith and your religion, to discharge there both your own office and mine, that there may be nothing wanting either to discipline or diligence. In respect of means, moreover, for meeting the expenses, whether for those who, having confessed their Lord with a glorious voice, having been put in prison, or for those who are laboring in poverty and want, and still stand fast in the Lord, I entreat that nothing be wanting, since the whole of the small sum which was collected there was distributed among the clergy for cases of that kind, that many might have means whence they could assist the necessities and burthens of individuals. I beg also that there may be no lack on your parts of wisdom and carefulness to preserve peace. For although from their affection the brethren are eager to approach and to visit those good confessors on whom by their glorious beginnings the divine consideration has already shed a brightness, yet I think that this eagerness must be cautiously indulged, and not in crowds, not in numbers collected together at once, lest from this very thing ill will be aroused, and the means of access be denied, and thus, while we insatiably wish for all, we lose all. Take counsel, therefore, and see that this may be more safely managed with moderation, so that the presbyters also, who there offer with the confessors, may one by one take turns with the deacons individually, because by thus changing the persons and varying the people that come together, suspicion is diminished. For, meek and humble in all things, as befits the servants of God, we ought to accommodate ourselves to the times, and to provide for quietness, and to have regard to the people. I bid you, brethren, beloved and dearly longed for, always heartily farewell, and have me in remembrance. Greet all the brotherhood. Victor the deacon, and those who are with me, greet you. Farewell. Epistle 5. To the presbyters and deacons. Argument. The argument of this letter is nearly the same as that of the preceding one, except that the writer directs the confessors also to be admonished by the clergy of their duty to give attention to humility and obey the presbyters and deacons. His own retirement incidentally furnishes an occasion for this. Cyprian, to the presbyters and deacons, his brethren, greeting. I had wished indeed, beloved brethren, with this my letter to greet the whole of my clergy in health and safety. But since the stormy time, which has in a great measure overwhelmed my people, has, moreover, added this enhancement to my sorrows, that it has touched with its desolation, even a portion of the clergy, I pray the Lord that, by the divine mercy, I may hereafter greet you at all events as safe, who, as I have learned, stand fast both in faith and virtue. And although some reasons might appear to urge me to the duty of myself hastening to come to you firstly, for instance, because of my eagerness and desire for you, which is the chief consideration in my prayers, and then, that we might be able to consult together on those matters which are required by the general advantage in respect of the government of the Church, and having carefully examined them with abundant counsel, might wisely arrange them, yet it seemed to me better still to preserve my retreat and my quiet for a while, with a view to other advantages connected with the peace and safety of us all, of which advantages an account will be given you by our beloved brother Tertullius, who, besides his other care which he zealously bestows on divine labors, was, moreover, the author of this counsel, that I should be cautious and moderate, and not rashly trust myself into the sight of the public, and especially that I should beware of that place where I had been so often inquired for and sought after. Relying, therefore, upon your love and your piety, which I have abundantly known, in this letter I both exhort and command you that those of you whose presence there is least suspicious and least perilous should in my stead discharge my duty in respect of doing those things which are required for the religious administration. In the meantime, let the poor be taken care of as much and as well as possible, but especially those who have stood with unshaken faith and have not forsaken Christ's flock, that, by your diligence, means be supplied to them to enable them to bear their poverty, so that what the troublous time has not effected in respect of their faith may not be accomplished by want in respect of their afflictions. Let a more earnest care, moreover, be bestowed upon the glorious confessors. And although I know that very many of those have been maintained by the vow and by the love of the brethren, yet if there be any who are in want either of clothing or maintenance, let them be supplied with whatever things are necessary, as I formerly wrote to you while they were still kept in prison. Only let them know from you and be instructed and learn what, according to the authority of Scripture, the discipline of the Church requires of them, that they ought to be humble and modest and peaceable, that they should maintain the honor of their name, so that those who have achieved glory by what they have testified may achieve glory also by their characters, and in all things, seeking the Lord's approval, may show themselves worthy in consummation of their praise to attain a heavenly crown. For there remains more than what is yet seen to be accomplished, since it is written, quote, "Praise not any man before his death," end quote. And again, quote, "Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life," end quote. And the Lord also says, quote, "He that endureth to the end, the same shall be saved," end quote. Let them imitate the Lord, who at the very time of his passion was not more proud, but more humble. For then he washed his disciples' feet, saying, quote, "If I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that ye should do as I have done to you." End quote. Let them also follow the example of the Apostle Paul, who, after imprisonment, often repeated, after scourging, after exposures to wild beasts, in everything continued meek and humble, and even after his rapture to the third heaven in paradise, he did not proudly arrogate anything to himself when he said, quote, "Neither did we eat any man's bread for naught, but wrought with labor and travail night and day, that we might not be chargeable to any of you." End quote. These several matters, I pray you, suggest to our brethren, and as he who humbleth himself shall be exalted, now is the time when they should rather fear the ensnaring adversary, who more eagerly attacks the man that is strongest, and becoming more virulent, for the very reason that he is conquered, strives to overcome his conqueror. The Lord grant that I may soon both see them again, and by salutary exhortation may establish their minds to preserve their glory. For I am grieved when I hear that some of them run about wickedly and proudly, and give themselves up to follies or to discords, that members of Christ, and even members that have confessed Christ, are defiled by unlawful concubinage, and cannot be ruled either by deacons or by presbyters, but cause that, by the wicked and evil characters of a few, the honorable glories of many and good confessors are tarnished, whom they ought to fear, lest, being condemned by their testimony and judgment, they be excluded from their fellowship. That, finally, is the illustrious and true confessor, concerning whom afterwards the church does not blush, but boasts. In respect of that which our fellow presbyters, Donatus and Fortunatus, Novatus and Gorgias, wrote to me, I have not been able to reply by myself, since, from the first commencement of my episcopacy, I made up my mind to do nothing on my own private opinion, without your advice and without the consent of the people. But as soon as, by the grace of God, I shall have come to you, then we will discuss in common, as our respective dignity requires, those things which either have been or are to be done. I bid you, brethren, beloved and dearly longed for, ever heartily farewell, and be mindful of me. Greet the brotherhood that is with you, earnestly from me, and tell them to remember me. Farewell. Epistle 6, to Rogatianus, the presbyter, and the other confessors. Argument. He exhorts Rogatianus and the other confessors to maintain discipline, that none who had confessed Christ in word should seem to deny him in deed, casually rebuking some of them who, being exiled on account of the faith, were not afraid to return unbidden into their country. Cyprian, to the presbyter Rogatianus, and to the other confessors, his brethren, greeting. I had both heretofore, dearly beloved and bravest brethren, sent you a letter, in which I congratulated your faith and virtue with exulting words, and now my voice has no other object, first of all, than with joyous mind, repeatedly and always, to announce the glory of your name. For what can I wish greater or better in my prayers than to seek the flock of Christ enlightened by the honor of your confession? For although all the brethren ought to rejoice in this, yet in the common gladness the share of the bishop is the greatest. For the glory of the church is the glory of the bishop. In proportion as we grieve over those whom a hostile persecution has cast down, in the same proportion we rejoice over you whom the devil has not been able to overcome. Yet I exhort you by our common faith, by the true and simple love of my heart towards you, that, having overcome the adversary in this first encounter, you should hold fast your glory with a brave and persevering virtue. We are still in the world. We are still placed in the battlefield. We fight daily for our lives. Care must be taken that after such beginnings as these, there should also come an increase, and that what you have begun to be with such a blessed commencement should be consummated in you. It is a slight thing to have been able to attain anything. It is more to be able to keep what you have attained, even as faith itself and saving birth makes alive, not by being received, but by being preserved. Nor is it actually the attainment, but the perfecting, that keeps a man for God. The Lord taught this in his instruction when he said, quote, Behold, thou art made whole, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. End quote. Conceive of him as saying this also to his confessor, quote, Lo, thou art made a confessor, sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto thee. End quote. Solomon also, and Saul, and many others, so long as they walked in the Lord's ways, were able to keep the grace given to them. When the discipline of the Lord was forsaken by them, grace also forsook them. We must persevere in the straight and narrow road of praise and glory, and since peacefulness and humility and the tranquility of a good life is fitting for all Christians, according to the word of the Lord, who looks to none other man than to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and that trembleth at his word, it the more behooves you confessors, who have been made an example to the rest of the brethren, to observe and fulfill this, as being those whose characters should provoke to imitation the life and conduct of all. For as the Jews were alienated from God, as those on whose account the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles, so on the other hand, those are dear to God, through whose conformity to discipline the name of God is declared with a testimony of praise, as it is written, the Lord himself forewarning and saying, quote, Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. End quote. And Paul the Apostle says, quote, Shine as lights in the world. End quote. And similarly, Peter exhorts, quote, As strangers, says he, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify the Lord. End quote. This, indeed, the greatest part of you, I rejoice to say, are careful for, and made better by the honor of your confession itself, guard and preserve its glory by tranquil and virtuous lives. But I hear that some infect your number, and destroy the praise of a distinguished name by their corrupt conversation, whom you yourselves, even as being lovers and guardians of your own praise, should rebuke and check and correct. For what a disgrace is suffered by your name, when one spends his days in intoxication and debauchery, another returns to that country whence he was banished, to perish when arrested, not now as being a Christian, but as being a criminal. I hear that some are puffed up and are arrogant, although it is written, quote, Be not high-minded, but fear, for if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. End quote. Our Lord was led as a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. I am not rebellious, says he, neither do I gainsay. I gave my back to the smiters, and my cheeks to the palms of their hands. I hid not my face from the filthiness of spitting. And dares anyone now, who lives by and in this very one, lift up himself and be haughty, forgetful as well of the deeds which he did, as well of the commands which he left to us either by himself or by his apostles? But if the servant is not greater than his Lord, let those who follow the Lord humbly and peacefully and silently tread in his steps, since the lower one is, the more exalted he may become. As says the Lord, quote, He that is least among you, the same shall be great. End quote. What then is that? How execrable should it appear to you, which I have learnt with extreme anguish and grief of mind, to wit, that there are not wanting those who defile the temples of God, and the members sanctified after confession and made glorious, with the disgraceful and infamous concubinage, associating their beds promiscuously with women's, in which, even if there be no pollution of their conscience, there is a great guilt in this very thing, that by their offense originate examples for the ruin of others. There ought also to be no contentions and emulations among you, since the Lord left to us his peace, and it is written, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. But if ye bite and find fault with one another, take heed that ye be not consumed one of another. From abuse and revilings also I entreat you to abstain, for, revilers do not attain the kingdom of God. And the tongue, which has confessed Christ, should be preserved sound and pure with its honor. For he who, according to Christ's precept, speaks things peaceable and good and just, daily confesses Christ. We had renounced the world when we were baptized, but we have now indeed renounced the world when tried and approved by God. We leave all that we have and have followed the Lord, and stand and live in his faith and fear. Let us confirm one another by mutual exhortations, and let us more and more go forward in the Lord, so that when of his mercy he shall have made that peace which he promises to give, we may return to the church new and almost changed men, and may be received, whether by our brethren or by the heathen, in all things corrected and renewed for the better. And those who formerly admired our glory and our courage may now admire the discipline in our lives. And although I have most fully written to our clergy, both lately when you were still kept in prison, and now also again to supply whatever was needful, either for your clothing or for your food, yet I myself have also sent you from the small means of my own which I had with me, 250 pieces, and another 250 I had also sent before. Victor also, who from a reader has become a deacon and is with me, sent you 175. But I rejoice when I know that very many of our brethren of their love are striving with each other and are aiding your necessities with their contributions. I bid you, beloved brethren, ever heartily farewell, and be mindful of me. End of Epistle 6 of Cyprian.